Okay? All right. The last little idea is kind of interesting. It's talking about the abuse of percents. And so I'm going to give you an example here and see if you think that this is a true statement or not. So it says here, because of losses of your employer, you agreed to accept a temporary 10% pay cut. Your employer promises to give you a 10% pay raise after 6 months. So will your pay be restored to the original salary? You're making a certain amount. You'd rather have a pay cut than lose your job altogether, so you accept a 10% pay cut. If your boss promises to give you 10% back, doesn't that almost sound like you should be back to where you started? 10 for 10? Okay, but you got to be careful. Let me show you that this is actually not an accurate statement if you look at actual numbers. So let's just use some numbers here. Let's pretend that you made, I don't know, $30,000. If you started off at $30,000 and your boss said that you were going to have a 10% pay cut, we need to figure out what 10% of 30,000 is. Remember that word of means we're going to multiply, and we've got to multiply it by 10%, but let's say 10% as a decimal instead, so 0.10. What is 10% of 30,000? You should get 3,000, right? And so your boss is going to cut your pay by $3,000. If he cuts your pay by $3,000, what is going to be your new pay for the next 6 months? Well, I'm going to take that 30,000, I'm going to subtract 3,000, and I'm going to end up only making $27,000 for the next 6 months. But hey, that's better than losing my job altogether, right? So then, after those 6 months are over, your boss is going to take your $27,000 that you make, and he's going to give you a 10% pay raise, right? But he's not going to give you a 10% pay raise on $30,000. He's going to give you a 10% pay raise on $27,000. So what's 10% of $27,000? $2,700, right? So if you were making $27,000 and he gave you an extra $2,700, what would happen? What is your ending amount? Isn't that $29,700? Is that the same as what you were making before? Nah, right? So you're actually less $300. So 10% for 10% isn't really equivalent, because really they're taking 10% of a lower amount. So your boss is really going to give you back a lower amount than when you started. So you've got to be careful when they say 10% cut, but they promise to give you 10% back, because it's really not the same amount in the end. So be careful. Okay? And another example of that looks like this, number 10. It says, a politician states that if you elect me to office, I promise to cut your taxes each year for my first 3 years in office by 10% each year, for a total of 30%. Is this really accurate? So if I cut your taxes by 10% one year, and then 10% the other year, and then 10% the third year, is that the same as cutting it 30%? Well, let's look. Let's play with some numbers a little bit. So let's say our taxes, I don't know, are $1,000. I'm just making up these numbers. You could really do this with any starting amount just to show that it's not the same. If my first year my taxes were $1,000 and this politician said that he was going or she was going to reduce it by 10%, let's first figure out what 10% of 1,000 is. You should get 100, right? So that means the next year, if they cut the taxes by $100, my next year, I'm not paying $1,000 anymore. I'm now paying 1,000 minus 100, or $900, right? So my second year, I'm only paying $900 in taxes. And they promise to cut it again by another 10%. So what's 10% of 900? 90, right? So I was paying $900, but they reduced it by 90. So what's 900 minus 90? So my third year, I'm only paying $800 in taxes, and they're going to cut it again by 10%. So let's figure out what 10% of 810 is. You should get $81. So at the end, if I was paying $810, but they reduced it by $81, how much am I now gonna owe in taxes? So what's 810 minus 81? It looks like my taxes now are only $729. Again, I started with 10,000, they dropped it 10%. I started then with 900, they dropped it 10%. And then I started at 810 and they dropped it 10%. I now have a tax amount of $729. Let's show if that is or is not the same as taking my original amount and just cutting it by 30% instead. So let's take that $1,000 that I started with, and instead of doing 10, 10, 10, let's just do 30% right away. So let's figure out what 30% or 0.3 times 1,000 is. Looks like $300, right? So if I started off at 1,000 and they dropped it by $300, how much is that going to be in taxes if I take 300 away from 1,000? 700? So would you rather pay $700 or $720 in taxes? Or $729 in taxes? I don't know about you, but I'd rather pay only $700. So taking a chunk of 30% off the original is very different than taking 10% and then 10% and then 10%. So this politician's statement wasn't very accurate. 10, 10, 10 is not really equivalent to 30%. So be careful with when they use percents that it's not really the same amount. Okay? All right. Hope you understood all of 8.1a. I will make another video for 8.1b. Let me know if you need